Right. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Today, we're having a third workshop in the Polar Science series. And our speaker today is Dr. Nick Holschuh from Amherst College and also a senior researcher and team lead here at iharp. He's going to share with us about foundational concepts on polar science, specifically looking at ice sheets and sea ice. Welcome, Dr. Holschuh. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen here. Here.
Great, we can see it. Perfect.
Great. So I guess the goal for today is just to provide a high-level overview of the kind of ideas that underpin polar science, or at least the major questions that polar geophysicists have regarding ice sheets and sea ice. So feel free to ask questions as we go. This is meant to be somewhat informal. And if there is anything that if there's anything that's unclear, if there's vocabulary that I gloss over, please stop me in the moment so that I can catch it in real time. I often like to start with just this animation, which highlights.
Ask a question before we start,
Sure.
if you don't mind.
No, that's just fine.
Yeah, just exactly. We have ice sheets and in this slide.
Sorry, I missed the question. Could you say it one more time?
Ice sheets and sea ice. What are we seeing in this slide?
Oh, that's a great question. So in the foreground, what we're seeing here, this is all sea ice. And this thing that you see here, which all of this extends below the surface, that's the floating extension of an ice sheet. So yes, of course. And I'll give some definitions for those terms in a moment. But that's a great question. Thanks for shouting that out. So if I play this animation, this is showing two representations, one of the South Pole on the left and one of the North Pole on the right. And it's showing you remote sensing data products that capture seasonality in the cryosphere. So what you can see is that the icy parts, there's parts on land that are clearly changing over the seasons. There's parts of the ocean that are changing during the seasons. There are also some parts that are unchanging. Everything you see here, all of the white parts of this animation are parts of the cryosphere. And sea ice and land ice make up the major constituents of cryospheric science. So if we were to just label on this animation the parts that we're discussing here, there is the frozen surface of the ocean. Sea ice is the result of freezing sea surface water. Land ice, these parts that you see here that were essentially unchanging over the course of the animation, they're a product of what we call meteoric ice, or essentially snowfall, ice that falls from the sky. So when we're talking about sea ice and land ice, or glacier ice, or ice sheets, they actually originate from very different processes. So sea ice is the product of atmospheric controlled cooling of sea surface temperature. Land ice and glacier ice is the product of snowfall. So water that evaporates is transported in the atmosphere and is deposited as snow. Sea ice changes on very short timescales. It changes seasonally. You could see the growth and decay of sea ice over winter and summer seasons. The kind of longest lived sea ice on Earth, the oldest sea ice you can find, is less than about 10 years old. Land ice, by contrast, is much less variable on annual timescales, and land ice is as much as a million or more years old in some places in Antarctica. So they change on different timescales, they respond to different processes, and the major questions around sea ice and its future and glacier ice or land ice and its future are quite different. So we're going to break down some of the core concepts in sea ice science and land ice science and identify some of the major outstanding questions that scholars are thinking about today. We're going to start with land ice, and I may use these terms interchangeably. Land ice, which is meteoric ice stored on land, can also be referred to as glacier ice or glacial ice or ice sheets. So all of those things are kind of equivalent in my mind. And I wanted to start again with another animation of a glacier. This is Columbia Glacier. It sits in Alaska. This is a satellite image from 1998. And in a second, I'm going to play a time series of satellite images of Columbia Glacier. The important thing that I'm trying to emphasize here is that glaciers, land ice, ice sheets are dynamic systems. So they're not just a block of ice sitting on your table, melting passively in response to changes in air temperature. They are themselves physical systems that change according to the unique physics of ice flow. And so when we want to make predictions of their future, we need to understand the environment in which they sit, their interaction with the atmosphere and the ocean, but we also need to understand their internal system dynamics. So here is a time series, and I apologize that it's a little bit flashy. It's the nature of satellite imagery. A time series of change for Columbia Glacier over about a 2-decade, or actually, I guess the oldest satellite photos go back to 1970. So a 5-decade period of change. And there are a couple of things that you can really see in this animation. One is that the ice is flowing, that there's this sense of transport of material through the glacier system. You can also see that the terminus, that end point of the glacier where it meets the ocean in front, that terminus is retreating by fracture. The ice is breaking off into pieces through a process we call calving. And that rate at which the ice is breaking off is actually faster than the ice is flowing, which is leading to this retreat of the terminus of the glacier. We can also see that the ice is in contact with rock, it's in contact with water, it's in contact with the atmosphere above, and its behavior is in some ways controlled by its interaction with all of these different materials. So to understand its long-term evolution, we need to understand the interaction between ice and air, the interaction between ice and rock, the interaction between ice and water. So I mentioned a moment ago that land ice is meteoric ice. So it falls from the sky as snow. And as snow builds up and builds up and builds up, it transforms from the kind of snow that you might encounter on the street to solid glacial ice. So near the surface of glaciers and ice sheets, we have some mixture of air and snow. The density of ice is about 918 kilograms per cubic meter. The density of the snow-air mixture at the surface of glaciers is about 500 kilograms per cubic meter. And if you go out and look at a snow pile after a major snowfall in the northern US, you'd see that it's about 50% air, 50% ice. And the air can actually move through the pore space of the snow. So we have exchange between air and the broader atmosphere in this surface layer of glaciers. As that snow is buried, it progressively transitions into denser and denser material. So we lose all of the nice little fractal edges that you have at the edges of snowflakes, and you end up with an intermediate material called firn. Eventually, those pores that have air in them become disconnected from one another. It's no longer this interconnected, porous, permeable material, but instead those pores are closed off into bubbles. That behavior actually is what allows us to use ice cores to study Earth's past atmosphere. So air is trapped inside these bubbles. Those air bubbles are progressively buried. And then we can drill an ice core to collect 100,000-year-old ice. Trapped within it is samples of air from that same time period. But that air-snow mixture transitions into firn, which then transitions into that solid 918 kilogram per cubic meter glacial ice. So glaciers are all made of this metamorphosed snow. One defining characteristic of glaciers and ice sheets is that they have to span different climatic environments. If they only sat in one climate, for example, let's say they live in a cold enough climate where snow can survive the summer season, then snow would accumulate year after year after year after year, and the ice sheet would grow and grow and grow and grow infinitely. If a glacier only sat in an environment where snow couldn't survive the summer season, then it would melt and melt and melt and melt until it's gone. Glaciers connect those regions where snow can survive the summer to those regions where snow melts over the summer. In order for that system to stay in balance, ice actually has to flow from this area of snow survival to the area of snow melt. We call these different climatic regimes the accumulation zone. So either at high elevation or at high latitude, where the climate is colder, snow will survive the summer season. And glaciers then extend down into some climate, either at low elevation or low latitude, where snow will melt during the summer. And we call that region the ablation zone. Ice flow transfers ice from the accumulation to the ablation zone. And so for a glacier that's in balance, that's not changing on long time scales, it must be the case that as much ice is added every year in the accumulation zone as is lost in the ablation zone, and the ice is flowing through the system, bringing material from the accumulation zone to the ablation zone. Ice flows in the solid state by the propagation of defects through crystals. So it's a slightly different process to normal fluid flow, but conceptually it's still the same. H2O molecules are moving past one another, but they're doing it within a solid crystal lattice. This is an example of a land terminating glacier. This is Malaspina Glacier, sometimes called a Piedmont Glacier. In order for this system to be healthy, it must be the case that there's a large surface area that melts at low elevation near the terminus, because you have to, again, be melting as much ice as you're providing by snowfall year over year. And so in these land terminating glaciers, they're really controlled by a process that we call surface mass balance. Surface mass balance is the balance between accumulation as snowfall and melt to energy exchange between the ice and the atmosphere. So all of the addition of mass or the loss of mass is accomplished by either melt at the surface or precipitation. For glaciers that flow into the ocean, they can lose mass by that fracture process I described before. You'll often see the word calving. Calving is the mechanical mass wastage of ice by fracture. So there's an animation here over on the right, which I can hopefully get started, which is just a small calving event on a marine terminating glacier. But ice, again, can be lost from this system by the breaking of icebergs or either tabular or these large, otherwise icebergs from the terminus of the glacier. You'll often hear folks talk about glacier calving and the breaking off of icebergs as if it is kind of an inherently bad thing or a signal of climate change. That's not true. For a glacier to be in balance, it could be that it is calving just as fast as snow is being added to the surface. And under those conditions, the terminus of the glacier won't change its length through time. I see there's a raised hand. You want to, someone
Yes.
want to jump? Yes, what's your question?
Thank you, Dr. Nick. Just here, quick questions. Like when the calving is happening, it will always start from the downside of the ice sheets, or it can be from upper side also. Like in the animation, I can see that from the downside first fall down, then adjacent ones effects. So will you please?
So yeah, the mechanics of calving are very actively studied because this process actually requires understanding a lot about the material strength of the ice which is poorly understood in real glacier systems. And so there are some glaciers, if I draw, here's a cross section of a glacier, it's flowing from left to right, and it encounters the ocean on the right. Some glaciers, they melt off their base if they're in contact with warm water. And then there's a flexural stress as the top pulls away, it's unbuttressed and it pulls away, and you'll open up a fracture that will then penetrate through the ice sheet and it will fall forward. There are glaciers that calve, if I draw that system again, where because this cliff in the front of the glacier is not supported by anything, that sometimes this part of the glacier will slump, it will fall off, and because ice is less dense than water, the toe of the glacier is positively buoyant, and so it will want to rise, and there will be a bending stress that will open a crevasse on the underside of the glacier that will then extend, and you'll see the iceberg kind of roll out in that direction. You'll also find in some places where the ice is undergoing very rapid extension that this whole part of the ice shelf is flowing so fast that it will kind of separate, it will pull apart as a rift and separate as a nice coherent block that will then float away from the ice shelf. And all three of those modes of calving are observed in nature. And the specific mode of calving that occurs will depend on how actively you're melting the toe of the glacier, how many pre-existing weaknesses exist in the ice as it flows out towards the ocean, and essentially how fast the ice is flowing at that location.
So just another quick question, Dr. Nick, is there any like physics-based models already available to like simulate this the glacier or ice calving melting?
So
suppose now it is 2025, what will happen in 2100? Like,
yeah, it's a great question. I would say that that is one of the major unanswered questions in the field that's very actively debated. You know, what is the right model for glacier calving into the future? The specific field of physics that covers fracture is called, at least one of the fields of physics that covers fracture is called linear elastic fracture mechanics. And an analogy that I really like is, you know, imagine everyone in the room is holding a ceramic coffee mug. And they took that coffee mug and they threw it up in the air and they let it hit the ground. For some, the coffee mug would shatter into 100 pieces. For some, it would bounce. For others, the handle would break off. And the details of that fracture depend very sensitively on the exact configuration of the mug when it hits the ground and any, like I said, pre-existing weakness in the material. And because it's so sensitive to those two things, making projections is very difficult. But this is something that is very actively studied. There are, you know, among the big questions in glaciology right now, getting calving right is one of the highest priority targets.
And it is nature data, so much unpredictable.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, thank you for.
You're welcome. So if we go back to just this schematic diagram and we're thinking about making projections of glacier change in the future, we need to understand something about changes to accumulation. You know, how might precipitation, evaporation, and water transport change in time? We have to think about ablation. Ablation can just be a product of atmospheric warming, so surface melt and changes to surface mass balance, or it could be a product of calving. And we also need to think about the physics of ice flow. How is ice being transported from the ablation zone, the accumulation zone to the ablation zone? All three of those things matter in making a projection. So one of the things I haven't talked much about is ice flow. So this map on the right is a map from surface. It's a map of surface velocity from satellite imagery. So it's showing how fast is the ice moving based on repeat measurements from satellites. And you can see that there is this somewhat complex pattern of ice flow around Antarctica. So things that are plotted in red are moving very fast. Things that are plotted in blue are moving fairly slowly. That motion is accommodated by two physical processes. So again, if this is our little three-dimensional model of a glacier, and let's say here it's flowing from right to left, some of the motion of ice is accommodated by what I would call viscous flow, deformation within the ice sheet. So I talked about the kind of propagation of defects through a crystal. This motion, some of the motion of glaciers, is accommodated simply by the deformation of the ice itself. And when we think about how fast a little parcel of ice at the surface is moving, it is a product of the integrated deformation of all of the ice below it. So if the ice below it is stretching and thinning, the ice that sits on it is being carried with that ice below as it stretches and thins. One of the other processes that governs ice flow is what we would call glacier sliding. Glacier sliding is kind of a catch-all term. It's not a physical process insofar as it can be described by a single equation, but it's a parameterized process that tries to capture the interaction between ice and rock and water and disaggregated sediment. Because at the base of glaciers, there's this complex interaction that's playing out. And it's playing out on the scale of millimeters and the scale of tens of meters, which makes it very hard to capture in models. So there are a number of distinct laws that get defined in ice sheet models to relate the stresses, the forces that govern ice flow, and the rate at which ice slides. Some of them are focused on how ice flows past obstacles to flow. So ice has to be able to work around the complex morphology of the bed. And the physics of ice flowing around obstacles takes one functional form. There's also the prospect that the material the ice sits on is itself deforming and can convey the ice through the deformation of the material underneath. Because in some places, ice is sitting on this disaggregated sediment that we call glacier till. And so there's a different brand of physics, kind of granular physics, that governs the deformation of glacial till. It can also move by kind of large-scale failure at the interface between ice and the rock underneath or within the material underneath. You can think about that kind of like an earthquake, where you get sliding along an interface. That is governed by another different set of physics. So there are a bunch of folks who are trying to understand from first principles, how does ice slide? And once we know from first principles, then we can ask the question, what's the right way to represent glacier sliding in an ice sheet model? Because both the deformation of ice and glacier sliding are required to get the motion of ice, the translation of ice from the accumulation zone to the ablation zone correct. So land ice is stored in several different types of reservoirs in the Earth system. So there are major ice sheets. The real difference between an ice sheet and a glacier is basically scale. Ice sheets are large. They span huge areas, are large reservoirs of ice. There are also alpine glaciers that sit at high elevation, typically, that are much smaller in scale, but are still very important for the Earth system. So glaciers matter for a number of reasons. Snow will accumulate during the wet season in alpine glaciers, and then during the hot, dry season, ice will melt. And so that means glaciers are buffers of water from the wet season to the dry season. Especially in Southeast Asia, the glaciers that sit in the Himalaya feed the 5 major rivers that supply the populations in South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia. The Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Yellow River, the Yangtze River, all of these are fed by meltwater from glaciers in the Himalaya. And so the fate of these glaciers really matters for those people for whom agriculture and fresh water are really supplied by glacial melt. In places like Scandinavia and the Pacific Northwest of the United States, glacier runoff and rivers fed by glacier runoff are one of the primary sources for electricity. So for hydropower production in these places where glaciers, again, buffer water from the wet season to the dry season, glacier melt, and understanding the future of glaciers is really important. So it's actually the energy industry in Scandinavia that's really focused on understanding the future of glaciers there. Earth's major ice sheets play a unique role in the climate system. They're a source of fresh water to the ocean. They are obstacles to atmospheric circulation. They're big, bright, reflective surfaces. And so they play a major role in governing Earth's energy balance and the exchange of water between the terrestrial ecosystems and marine systems. They also, of course, buffer sea level. So as ice sheets melt, we see sea level rise. If ice sheets were to grow, we would see sea level fall. During the last glacial maximum, about 20,000 years ago, ice sheets were significantly larger. There were extensive ice sheets across North America and Northern Europe, and sea level was about 120 meters lower. So sea levels have, or ice sheets have the potential to store significant ocean water on land. I present this here to give you a sense of relative scale for Antarctica and Greenland, our two persistent ice sheets that remain. If you were to melt all of the ice in Greenland, sea level would go up by about 7.5 meters, just over 7 meters of sea level rise. If you were to melt all of East Antarctica contains about 65 meters of sea level equivalent water. So if all of East Antarctica were to melt, sea level would go up by 65 meters. West Antarctica contains about 5 to 6 meters of sea level equivalent ice, but a lot of it actually sits on rock that is below sea level. So if you were to melt West Antarctica, sea level would rise by about 3.5 meters. So these are major reservoirs of water. They are situated in very different climatological environments. Differential heating of the atmosphere and the ocean by the sun. So the atmosphere and ocean are heated by the sun. They're heated primarily in the equator, where the intensity of the sun's light is greatest. Differential heating from the equator to the poles, combined with the rotation of the planet, leads to large-scale atmospheric and ocean circulation. These green lines that I've plotted here would be the general flow of the upper part of the atmosphere if it didn't interact with any part of the land surface. So we would expect this general west to east flow in the mid latitudes, kind of at 45 degrees north, 45 degrees south, extending up towards the poles, that goes from west to east. The reality is that these currents in the atmosphere, interact with the land surface. Sorry, that's not liking my erasing. Try this one more time. There we go. In the northern hemisphere, these atmospheric currents interact with the continents and the major mountain ranges that sit on the continents. In the southern hemisphere, the major atmospheric circulation is essentially unimpeded by the land surface. And so what that means is that the atmosphere and ocean circulate in very different ways in and around the North Pole when compared with the South Pole. In the northern hemisphere, because that westerly wind interacts with the Rocky Mountains in the western US and with the mountains of Central Europe and Central Asia, that causes a deflection of that atmospheric current, a wobble to the jet stream. And so warm air is actually transported much further to the north in the northern hemisphere than it is to the south. In the south, we have this very active, unimpeded west to east transport of energy that sits north of Antarctica. So Antarctica is climatically isolated. Its average annual temperature is still extremely cold, but the presence of the continents in the northern hemisphere means both ocean circulation and atmospheric circulation transport heat further to the north. So when we think about what drives changes to the Greenland ice sheet and compare it to changes to the Antarctic ice sheet, we can see that these systems are actually responding to different things in the modern. I've drawn these two little cross sections, one of the Antarctic ice sheet on the left, one of the Greenland ice sheet on the right. Both Antarctica and Greenland are losing mass. The driving force for their mass loss is different. Greenland is responding to atmospheric warming. And so almost 50% of the mass loss in Greenland is driven by this change in surface mass balance. Warming atmosphere that drives melt at the surface, and that melt then runs off as meltwater to the ocean where it contributes to sea level rise. Antarctica is isolated, like I said, by those polar westerlies. And so atmospheric temperatures in Antarctica are warming, but they haven't warmed enough to actually initiate significant surface melt. In fact, some of the warmer atmospheric temperature in Antarctica is actually leading to increased precipitation. The reason Antarctica is losing ice is because of warm ocean water. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. When we look at melt in Greenland, what we see is that surface melt is changing. The area over which surface melt is experienced is expanding, and it's now extended from the low elevation coastal environments more into the interior. So this map over here is showing that the melt extent in 1992 is in pink. The melt extent in 2005 is in red. And you can see that the area over which we're experiencing surface melt is growing up to higher elevation. There's actually a strong positive feedback in glacier systems that when the air temperature warms, we might change this boundary between the accumulation and the ablation zone. So we'll change at what elevation melt is occurring. As the atmosphere warms, melt creeps up to higher elevation. And because of the characteristic shape of glacier systems, they have this concave down surface. The area exposed to surface melt grows non-linearly. So we might expect that with every incremental change in atmospheric temperature, we actually have a non-linear growth in the amount of melt that's experienced by the ice sheet. So the Greenland ice sheet is experiencing some of these elevation feedbacks. As it melts, the surface lowers. As the surface lowers, the area exposed to melt grows. The surface lowers, the area exposed to melt grows. And that results in kind of accelerating ice loss in Greenland. If we strip away all of the ice in Antarctica and we leave behind a map of the elevation of the bedrock underneath, we have something that looks like this on the right. If I zoom in here. Blue and white represents areas where the rock is below sea level. Green is areas where the rock is above sea level. The West Antarctic ice sheet actually sits on rock well below sea level. As a result, we call it a marine ice sheet. The West Antarctic ice sheet is vulnerable to melt associated with changes in the transport of warm, salty, deep ocean water. This map over here on the right is a map of the elevation of the seafloor. So the thing that's masked in black, that's the limit of the Antarctic ice sheet. Offshore of the Antarctic ice sheet, there's this relatively shallow seafloor. We call it the continental shelf. And as you move away from that relatively shallow seafloor, you get deep abyssal ocean. Sitting in that deep abyssal ocean is relatively warm. And when I say relatively warm, I mean about 2 degrees Celsius. Relatively warm water. The reason that warm water sits at the bottom of the ocean is because it's very salty. So sitting above it is relatively fresh, relatively cold surface water. So this warm, salty water is negatively buoyant. It likes to sit close to the seafloor and mostly sits off the continental shelf of Antarctica. But the winds they apply a stress to the surface ocean, which can actually pump that warm water up against the margins of the ice sheet. So over here, that red color, I'm going to start an animation in a second. This is showing that relatively warm water trapped offshore. This animation that I've just started, this is an animation of it's a tracer transport model that's showing the transport of water from the deep ocean up against the ice sheet margin. So what we see is that the winds around Antarctica are changing, and they're actually pumping more and more of this warm circumpolar deep water, this warm 2 degrees seawater, up against the edge of the ice sheet. And instead of melting from above, as is happening in Greenland, Antarctica is melting from below, from this incursion of warm water. I'm going to skip a few slides here and get to some measurements of glacier change. We have a constellation of amazing satellites that measure changes to Antarctica and Greenland. One directly measures the mass of the ice sheets. This satellite pair is called GRACE, the Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment. GRACE is a pair of twin satellites that orbit the Earth. And their orbit, the shape of their orbit, is governed by the distribution of mass in the Earth system, right? They're all being pulled on by the Earth, and they're being pulled on by masses that are not distributed equally in space. By measuring the distance between this pair of satellites in time, you can actually measure the distribution of mass in the Earth's surface, in the Earth system, and you can measure how that distribution of mass changes. So one thing we can do is measure mass change. We also have satellite laser altimeters. These are measuring the position of Earth's surface. By sending light from the satellite down to the surface, and that light that reflects off the surface and comes back, you can measure the distance from the satellite to Earth's surface and how that distance changes in time. So we can watch Earth's surface move up, we can watch Earth's surface move down. This animation is showing a time series of mass change from the GRACE satellite. So areas that are plotted in red are areas where mass has been lost. Areas plotted in blue are areas where mass is being gained. And what we start to see is that the low elevation areas around the margins of the Greenland ice sheet, where surface melt is occurring, those areas are losing mass. When we look at Antarctica, that region of West Antarctica where warm circumpolar deep water is being pumped up against the edge of the ice sheet, in that area, ice is being lost. So we can already start to see that there are different processes at play in these two environments. And making projections of the future of Antarctica and Greenland depends on getting these processes right. This map is from the laser altimeter, ISAT-2. Areas in red are places where the surface is lowering. Areas in blue are places where the surface is moving up. Again, we see that same pattern. The surface is melting and is lowering around the margins of Greenland, where surface mass balance dominates, in West Antarctica, where this warm circumpolar deep water dominates. So when scientists are trying to understand the drivers of mass change, one of the things that they do is try and deconvolve the effect of surface mass balance, so changes in melts associated with atmospheric warming, and dynamic thinning, changes in the thickness of the ice due to ice flow. And this plot up here is showing in Greenland the partitioning between surface mass balance in yellow and dynamic thinning in blue. So changes in ice volume in Greenland are really governed by those changes in surface mass balance. In Antarctica, it's essentially all dynamic thinning. I'll just say one other thing before we move on to sea ice, since we're running out of time. There's an entirely different community of people who are focused on understanding sea level and the sea level budget. So we can measure global sea level from sea surface measurements from satellites, from tide gauges around coasts, and we can try and explain the pattern of sea level rise. The sea level rises globally for a couple of reasons. One, as ocean water warms, its density changes. And so there's this process called thermal expansion. As the atmosphere warms and energy is transferred into the ocean, or as the ocean warms directly from light from the sun, the density of the ocean can change and sea level will rise. Thermal expansion. That's one driver. Another driver is changes in land water storage. So water that is currently stored on land, either in the form of glacier ice or stored in rivers, lakes, or subsurface aquifers. Changes in land water storage can also drive sea level rise. In the early 90s, sea level rise was dominated by thermal expansion, changes in the temperature of the ocean. To a lesser extent, sea level rise was governed by melt of small alpine glaciers. But essentially, the ice sheets had no major role in sea level rise in the 1990s. Now, the ice sheets are starting to dominate the signal of sea level rise. And so they're becoming increasingly important to the sea level community as well. Okay, so hopefully that highlights for you, like, what is a glacier? What are some of the major outstanding questions in glaciology? We really want to understand its interaction with the atmosphere and ocean. We want to understand the physics of ice flow. We want to understand the physics of ice fracture. We want to think about the distribution of melt at the surface. There are all kinds of interesting questions related to land ice. Sea ice. Sea ice is different. Sea ice is not the product of atmospheric deposition of snow. Sea ice is the product of the freezing of the ocean surface. Sea ice is actually kind of an interesting thing for one very important reason. Water's density is temperature dependent. Saltwater, like the ocean, experiences increasing density with decreasing temperature. As salt water gets colder and colder and colder, it gets more dense. That should raise major questions about how sea ice forms. So the way that the ocean can cool is by energy exchange with the atmosphere or radiative transfer. So the ocean only really exchanges energy at the surface. So if we cool surface ocean waters, we would expect them to get dense and sink and be replaced by warmer waters. And so we would expect that as we progressively cool surface waters, it would always be removed from the surface environment, which would prevent it from further cooling. If that were the case, then the only way we could produce sea ice is if we cooled the entire ocean to its freezing point. Thankfully, the ocean is stratified. So it's stratified not just based on temperature, but it's stratified based on temperature and salinity. So this plot up here on the top is a cross-section of the ocean. The left edge is near the South Pole. The right edge is at high latitude in the north. The y-axis is depth in the ocean. The top plot is showing temperature. So we can see that in the equator, there's warm surface water. When we look at the temperature at the poles, there's actually relatively cold surface water. If instead we look at salinity, we see that at the surface, there's very saline, very salty water in the tropics, and extremely fresh water at the poles. At the poles, the ocean is primarily stratified because of salinity. So really cold water, which would otherwise be dense and sink, can stay at the surface because it's fresh. It can sit on relatively warm, deep water that is salty. So because we maintain this salinity stratified surface ocean, in the winter, we can cool that relatively fresh water to the freezing point where it will eventually form sea ice. Ice is thermally insulating. So this animation that I'm showing on the right is a really simplistic sea ice model. As soon as you start to grow sea ice at the surface of the ocean, it now is trapping the heat of the ocean underneath. In order for more sea ice to form, for ice to continue to grow at that boundary between ice and ocean, you actually have to conduct heat through the ice lid to the atmosphere where it can be lost. And because ice is not a very effective thermal conductor, As the ice gets thicker and thicker and thicker, it makes it harder and harder and harder to get that energy out of the ocean for new sea ice to form. So on a yearly basis, sea ice will kind of grow to about a meter thick, and then the process of sea ice growth will slow down dramatically because growing more sea ice requires conducting that energy out through the surface. Only in places where the sea ice can thicken by mechanical processes can we end up getting ice that's more than a few meters thick. Ice that gets to be more than a meter thick can sometimes survive the summer and become what we would call multi-year sea ice. Most sea ice, all the sea ice around Antarctica, and much of the sea ice in the northern hemisphere is seasonal. That's to say that every year it regrows from freezing and melts away. In the Arctic Ocean, where the ocean extends all the way to the North Pole, some sea ice survives the summer. That can become multi-year sea ice that can be thicker. In this map, you can see that the multi-year sea ice is often also what we call land-fast ice, ice that's bound to the margins of the continents. And in this case, at its thickest, it's only like 3 meters thick. Understanding the fate of multi-year sea ice, whether or not we'll continue to have multi-year sea ice in the Arctic, is a major question. Sea ice first forms by freezing at the surface, and you form this ice that is often called grease ice because it suppresses the very small-scale capillary waves that exist at the surface of the ocean, and it makes the surface of the ocean look extremely smooth. In this case, this is ice. This is a gap in the sea ice, what we often call a lead. As sea ice thickens, but still has leads and is being blown around by the wind, it will change it mechanically into something that's called pancake ice. Pancake ice are these little rafts of sea ice that bump into each other, round out their edges and thicken, that lead to this kind of discontinuous sea ice surface. The gaps between pancake ice will continue to freeze, and you'll eventually end up with a continuous sheet. If that accumulates, mechanically thickened by the winds, trapped in places where it can survive the winter, you can form multi-year sea ice, which is thick. Ultimately, multi-year sea ice melts by the accumulation of melt ponds at the surface. So snow will fall on the sea ice and accumulate. As you move into the summer season, some of that snow will melt and form melt ponds, and those melt ponds are really effective absorbers of solar radiation. So the breakdown of sea ice is really often controlled by this thermal process of initiating melt, accumulating water, then that water is a really effective absorber of sunlight, which will then drive further melt. Modeling sea ice and getting sea ice right is first a question of trying to figure out how thick did the sea ice get over the year. Sea ice thickness is a very hard thing to measure, and so that's one of these major outstanding questions. How thick is the sea ice? How thick does it get year over year? So that you can model the kind of thermodynamics of its melt and the mechanical interaction between sea ice flows. Understanding how it interacts with the wind and how sea ice flows interact with each other is again a major component of sea ice research. Sea ice is a bright reflective surface, and so it plays a role in keeping the polar climates cool. But the area covered by sea ice and the area covered by summer sea ice is changing. So this animation is a time series showing seasonality to Arctic sea ice. The things plotted in white are multi-year sea ice. The things plotted in that lighter gray color are just seasonal sea ice. This animation, I forget the exact time period for which it covers, but you can see that the sea ice is dynamic, right? It's being transported by the winds and the ocean out from this kind of trapped polar ocean. And so one of the things that controls the amount of multi-year sea ice is how much of it is transported by the winds to lower latitude where it can melt. But what we're seeing through time is a loss of multi-year sea ice and a shrinking area of winter and summer sea ice. I'm just going to skip forward to this map This shows the ice pack from 1985 at the sea ice minimum. So the point of the year where sea ice is at its lowest, and the ice pack in 2021. So you can see that the nature of the sea ice minimum has changed quite a bit in the past 40 years. This has interesting geopolitical implications. So sea ice in the Arctic is one of the major barriers to both oil and gas production and shipping. Like the Northwest Passage is this ideal transport pathway from Europe to Asia. And so the availability of shipping lanes through the Northwest Passage is this major geopolitical topic. It's also true that sea ice is a major player in governing both air-sea gas exchange. So actually, let me pause this video for a second. Carbon dioxide dissolution into the ocean is one of the major controls on atmospheric chemistry. So if we want to make projections of future CO2 concentrations, we need to know how CO2 dissolves in and it is exsolved from the ocean. Sea ice is a barrier to dissolution, and so the presence or absence of sea ice changes the amount of CO2 that gets released from the ocean and the amount of CO2 that gets dissolved in the ocean. The formation of sea ice also concentrates salt in the ocean. When sea ice forms, it rejects salt. Just pure water freezes out of the ocean. And so you hyper-concentrate salt in what are called brines. This is a process of this very cold, very salty water being rejected in what's called a brinicle, this little very cold brine that is rejected from the sea ice. And changes in sea ice production and melt change ocean salinity. So understanding sea ice production and melt is important for both air-sea gas exchange and sea surface salinity. I just thought I would present this because it's pretty cool. I've done a bunch of field work in Antarctica, and one of the things outside of the main US station in Antarctica is seasonal sea ice. And every year they drill this tube in the sea ice called the Ob tube, or at least they did 10 years ago, that you can crawl down in. This is me looking up the Ob tube after I've gone down, that takes you under the sea ice. And there's a glass viewing portal where you can see the sub-sea ice environment. And you can see that the sea ice is actually a really important component of the ecosystem. There are microbes that live on the bottom surface of the sea ice that feed the macrofauna. The surface of the sea ice is also the breeding ground for seals. It's why sea ice matters for polar bears, because polar bears hunt on sea ice where seals go to breed. So just kind of in summary, land ice is an important, it's an important component of the climate system. It regulates the energy balance for the polar environment. It is a store of fresh water, which is important for people, both as a resource and because of our interest in coastal communities. Sea ice is really important. It also modifies the polar energy balance. When sea ice melts, more energy is absorbed by the ocean, which results in something called polar amplification, enhanced warming at the poles. It matters for air-sea gas exchange. It matters for ecosystems in polar environments. It matters for sea salinity and ocean circulation. So I hope that covers some basics of land ice and sea ice science, introduces some of the vocabulary, some of the major outstanding research questions. I think with there, I guess I'll stop sharing my screen and take any questions any folks have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holschuh. It's been very insightful, especially because the first two workshops, the first one was on atmospheric science, and then the next one was on the oceanic side of it. And now you bringing in the sea ice concept then explains the interaction and relationship between, these three aspects of it. So it's definitely been very insightful. Do we have any questions? And we learned that there's a lot to unpack in each of those, right? And in your case, definitely you have shared a lot, and we know that there is much more. But we've had the terms being thrown around, especially the sea ice, the ice sheet, and it wasn't sure exactly what it was. So I appreciate Rhoda bringing that up from your first illustration in the slide. Do we have any questions in the last 5 minutes? I know all of you are familiar with the ice sheet and sea ice. Maybe it just resonated well. But for any questions, it would be, nice to bring it up now. While folks are thinking, I noticed with the Antarctic or the Greenland versus the Antarctica, the size of the Greenland is so much smaller, right?
Yes.
Could then, and given the factors that it's located in the north and the aspects of the mountainous regions could then, contribute to the ice melting faster. But at the same time, would this be because of, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, the size, has it always been much smaller, or has this just gradually become much smaller, I guess, over time because of, again, the impact on atmospheric factors there?
So yeah, it's a great question. I mean, northern hemisphere ice sheets have historically been much larger than even the Antarctic ice sheet. And some of that really depends on the state of global climate. So for an ice sheet to get very large, there has to be a large land area on which the ice sheet can grow. And the distribution of the continents today on Earth are such that we don't have a northern hemisphere polar continent, right? If looking at those maps, looking right at the top surface of the Earth, it's all ocean. The Antarctic ice sheet sits over the South Pole. And so right now, there's a larger land area in this extreme cold climate in the southern hemisphere than there is land area in the extreme cold climate in the northern hemisphere. So the Greenland ice sheet is somewhat restricted just by the size of the Greenland island on which it sits.
Okay.
And so 20,000 years ago, when the Earth was significantly colder than it is today, the threshold where you can generate an ice sheet that will persist through the summer, that latitude changed, right? We moved closer to the equator where we could support major ice sheets. And as we did that, we opened up all of the land area of the northern hemisphere continents. But as you do it in the southern hemisphere, as that latitude threshold moves further to the north, you don't actually expose a lot of new land area. You have the southern tip of South America, you have New Zealand and parts of Australia, South Africa. But as you move north from Antarctica, you don't gain a lot of land area very quickly. Whereas when you move south from the Arctic, the land area gets huge. And so when the global climate is cold enough that you're now seeing ice sheets extend to 60 degrees or 50 degrees or 40 degrees, that then creates huge ice sheets in the northern hemisphere, but doesn't really do much new in the southern hemisphere.
Yes, got it. Got it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Rhoda, you have a question?
Yes, just one. I'm just wondering, between man-induced causes and nature-induced causes, what is the leading cause of the processes that we are seeing right now, especially as relates to sea ice melting and calving and all the processes going on?
That's a great question. So in the Arctic, the signal is very clear that changes to surface mass balance for Greenland are almost entirely driven by human-caused global warming, by anthropogenic CO2 emissions. That the natural kind of trajectory of solar insolation, the amount of energy received by the sun in the northern hemisphere summer, is moving toward relatively weak northern hemisphere summers. So if it were really just governed by intensity of the light from the sun, we would expect that, if anything, the Greenland ice sheet should be under a period of moderate growth. So in Greenland, we know kind of beyond a shadow of a doubt that melt is almost entirely due to CO2 emissions. Antarctica is much more complicated. And because to go from CO2 emissions to the driving factor for change requires several causal links. We can see that CO2 emissions are leading to atmospheric warming. Atmospheric warming is driving surface mass balance changes in Greenland. That's only 2 steps. To go from anthropogenic CO2 emissions to melt in West Antarctica, you have to say CO2 emissions are causing tropical warming, which is changing polar winds, which is changing polar ocean circulation, which is driving marine melt. And that makes it a harder attribution. It's harder to test for the attribution for melt in West Antarctica. So I would say that in looking at summer sea ice change, in looking at Greenland melt, and in looking at glacier melt, it's very obvious that the driver is human CO2 emissions. In looking at Antarctic change, I think it's more open for debate.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nick. So we're right at 5:02. We want to appreciate your time, your knowledge. It's very valuable. Moving forward, I think now we can count ourselves close to experts, in understanding something about sea ice as, we apply our computational methods. Thank you again, Dr. Nick Holschuh. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you.